The wanted poster nailed to the post office door in Caldwell, Kansas listed a reward of $2,000 for Milton Stone, dead or alive, and Lillian Rourke used it to patch a hole in her henhouse wall. She had found it blowing across her yard one September morning in 1882, the paper creased and sun-bleached at the edges, the ink smeared where rain had caught it. She read it once, studied the rough sketch of a hard-jawed man with dark eyes and a scar along his left cheekbone, and then she pressed it flat against the rotting board where the wind came through at night and frightened her hens. She had more pressing concerns than outlaws. The well was going dry. The roof needed patching before the first frost. Her nearest neighbor, old Tom Pryor, had died in August and left nobody to ride to town with when the loneliness got heavy. She had a farm to run, and she would run it alone, the same way she had done every day since her husband James Rourke had gone cold in the ground 3 years past. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, a cattle town that smelled of dust and livestock, and occasionally of gunpowder. The surrounding territory was a vast and unpredictable place, the Kansas prairie rolling out in every direction like a brown sea, dotted with the occasional cottonwood or dry creek bed. Lillian's property sat 2 miles south of town, a modest homestead of 40 acres with a farmhouse, a barn, a struggling garden, and a gate made of rough cedar posts that she kept latched with a length of chain. She did not open that gate for strangers. She had learned early in her widowhood that strangers brought trouble or heartache, sometimes both. She was 28 years old. She had honey-brown hair that she kept pinned at the back of her neck during the day and let fall past her shoulders at night. Her eyes were the color of creek water in summer, green and shifting and difficult to read. She was not a woman who talked much, but when she did, people listened, because everything she said meant something. The first week of October arrived with a north wind and a sky the color of pewter. Lillian was mending fence line along the south pasture when she heard the horse before she saw it, the uneven rhythm of hooves that told her the animal was favoring a leg. She straightened up and shaded her eyes. A rider was coming across the open field, not along the road, which meant he was avoiding something. She watched him for a moment without moving. He sat low in the saddle, and even from that distance she could see the stiffness in his left side that told her he was hurt. She should have gone inside. She should have latched the gate and watched from the window. That is what every practical bone in her body told her to do. Instead, she stood where she was, a fence post in one hand and a hammer in the other, and she waited. The horse stopped at her gate. It was a big bay gelding, mud-caked and breathing hard. The man on its back was worse. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. His shirt on the left side was dark with blood, and his face beneath the grime and the stubble was pale, in a way that suggested he had been losing that blood for a while. He looked at her with eyes that were very dark and very steady, which she found remarkable given how much pain he was clearly in. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and level, the voice of a man who was working very hard to sound composed. "I apologize for coming to your fence this way. I'm not going to cause you any trouble. I just need a moment to rest my horse." Lillian looked at him for a long time. Then she walked to the gate and unhooked the chain. She did not know why she did it. That is the honest truth of it. She did not think it through the way she thought through most things. She simply unhooked the chain and swung the gate open and said, "Get that horse into the barn before somebody on the road sees him." He looked at her as though she had said something extraordinary. "You know who I am," he said. It was not a question. "I know you are bleeding through your shirt and your horse has gone lame," she said. "Come through before I change my mind." She had recognized him the moment he came close enough for her to see the scar on his cheek. The same scar from that smeared drawing on her henhouse wall, Milton Stone. The most wanted man in the Kansas territory, wanted for bank robbery, for the killing of a deputy marshal in Wichita, and for a dozen other crimes that the posters listed in small print below the bold letters of his name. $2,000. She knew exactly who he was, and she opened her gate anyway. She got him off the horse and into the barn without much ceremony. He was heavier than he looked, solid with muscle and bone, and when he swayed on his feet, she put her shoulder under his arm and steered him to the wooden stool beside the tack wall. He sat down without argument, which told her more about how badly he was hurt than anything else could have. A man who argues with being helped still has his strength. A man who simply sits is running close to empty. She examined the wound. A bullet had gone through the flesh of his left side below the ribs, and if it had hit anything vital he would already be dead, which meant it had passed clean through. It had bled considerably, and it needed cleaning and binding. She had done this before once for a ranch hand who had caught himself on a length of barbed wire in a bad way. Blood did not unsettle her. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I expect so," he said. She went to the house and brought back her medicine tin, a bottle of whiskey she kept for practical purposes, and a clean linen cloth she tore into strips. She cleaned the wound with the whiskey and he made no sound, though the tendons in his jaw went tight and his hands gripped the edge of the stool until his knuckles showed white. She bound it firmly and tied it off. "You should lie down," she said. "I should not stay here," he said. "You are in no condition to ride anywhere." "Ma'am, there are men behind me who will follow tracks. If they find me here, that is your problem too." She considered this. She was not unaware of the risk. She had been aware of it from the moment she opened the gate, and she had opened it anyway, and she was not the kind of woman who made decisions and then unraveled over them. "The creek runs behind the east pasture," she said. "Ride your horse through it for half a mile north and then come back through the timber. It won't eliminate all your tracks, but it will confuse anyone who is not a professional tracker, and most men chasing bounty are not professional trackers." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between surprise and something softer. "You have thought about this kind of thing before," he said. "I have thought about many things," she said. "I live alone and I pay attention. Now, are you going to argue with me or are you going to rest?" He rested. She put him in the barn, in the empty stall at the far end, on a bed of clean straw with a horse blanket over him. She gave him water and a plate of beans from the pot on her stove, and she left him to sleep. She went back to her fence mending, and she thought about what she had done, and she decided she did not regret it, which was the kind of decision that could change a person's entire life. She found that out over the following 3 days. He was stronger by the next morning, though not strong enough to ride without tearing open the wound again. She checked it at first light and found it clean, no sign of the corruption that could kill a man faster than the bullet itself. She brought him breakfast, eggs from her hens and cornbread from the skillet, and she sat on an upturned feed bucket and watched him eat. "You could turn me in," he said. $2,000 is a considerable sum." "Yes, it is," she agreed. "You would have a new roof," he said, looking up at the barn ceiling where thin lines of sky showed through the boards. "I would have a new roof," she agreed. "How do you know my roof needs fixing?" "I looked at the house when you brought me in," he said. "I notice things." "So do I," she said. They sat quietly for a moment. Outside, a meadowlark was singing from somewhere in the pasture, its bright liquid notes incongruous with the gray weight of the October morning. "Why did you open the gate?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, turning the question over. "You needed help," she said finally. "A person needed help and I could give it. That seemed sufficient reason. I am a wanted man." "You were a bleeding man," she said. "That is what I saw." He looked at her steadily. Up close, in the morning light that came through the cracks in the barn boards, he was more complicated looking than the wanted poster suggested. The hardness was there, in the jaw and in the set of his mouth, but there was something else too, something careful and watchful that did not look like meanness. It looked like a man who had learned to keep a great deal of himself behind a wall because the things beyond the wall were too expensive to show. "My name is Milton Stone," he said. "I know," she said. "I used your wanted poster to patch my henhouse." For just a moment, something like a smile moved across his face and changed it entirely. "That may be the finest use that poster has ever been put to," he said. "I thought so," she said. "My name is Lillian Rourke. I own this property." I will help you for as long as you need help, and then you will ride out and not come back, because I cannot afford the kind of trouble your presence brings. Is that understood?" "That is entirely understood," he said. "And I am grateful, Mrs. Rourke." "Lillian," she said before she quite decided to. Then she stood up, smoothed her apron, and went back to the house. He stayed 3 days, and during those 3 days she learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape, one detail at a time. He was from Missouri originally, from a family of farmers who had lost everything in the years after the war. He had come west at 17, worked cattle drives on the Kishom Trail, done honest work for 5 years before the honest work stopped being enough to live on, and he made a decision he had been paying for ever since. He did not say what that decision was exactly, and she did not press him, because she could see the shape of it, and she understood that some stories are carried like wounds, not volunteered. He was not what she had expected. He was quiet more than he was loud, thoughtful more than he was reckless, and he had a way of looking at things, at her garden, at her horses, at the way the light moved across the prairie in the late afternoon, as though he was storing it all up against a time when he would not be able to see it anymore. That quality made her chest ache in a way she did not entirely welcome, because it told her something about how he lived and what he expected from his future. On the second day, when she came out to check his wound at midday, she found him not lying down but sitting in the barn doorway, watching her garden. He had been still long enough that a cottontail rabbit was grazing not 6 feet from him, unbothered. She stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at him. "You should be resting," she said. "I have been resting," he said. "I am not accustomed to sitting still." "What are you accustomed to?" He thought about it. "Moving," he said. "Always moving." She sat down on the step below him, which put her at his knee height, and she shaded her eyes and looked out at the garden. The rabbit bounded away. The wind moved through the dry corn stalks and made a papery sound. "I used to hate this stillness," she said. "When James died, I thought the quiet was the worst of it. Now I think it might be the best." "James was your husband," he said. "Yes, 3 years ago, fever, it was very quick." She said it simply, the way she had learned to say it, with the emotion held back like water behind a dam so she could get through the words without drowning in them. "I am sorry," he said, and it sounded like he meant it genuinely, not as a formality. "Thank you," she said. They were quiet for a while, and the quiet between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. On the third day, he was well enough to ride. She examined the wound that morning, and the flesh was knitting cleanly. She rewrapped it with fresh linen and told him he would need to keep it clean and change the dressing every 2 days, and he nodded, watching her work with those steady dark eyes. "I want to pay you," he said. "I do not want your money," she said. "I have honest money," he said, then paused. "Some of it." She looked up at him. "Then keep it for your horse," she said. "That animal needs better feed than trouble can afford." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a loose board on the east side of your house, second from the bottom, below the kitchen window. The nails have come out with the weather. If you have a hammer and some nails, I can fix it before I go." She looked at him for a long moment. "There is a hammer in the barn," she said. He fixed the board and 3 others he found while he was at it, moving carefully around the side of the house with the slight stiffness of a man managing his wound, working quietly and efficiently. She watched him from the kitchen window while she washed the breakfast dishes, and she felt something she did not want to name, a pulling toward him that she had not felt toward anyone since James, and the feeling scared her more than the bounty hunters scared her. When he came back to tell her he was done, she was standing in the yard with a folded cloth parcel that she had packed while he worked. Salt pork, cornbread, 2 apples from the tree at the south corner of the property, and a small bottle of the carbolic acid she had bought in Caldwell for the wound dressing. She held it out. "For the road," she said. He took it and looked at it. Then he looked at her, and the wall she had seen behind his eyes was not quite so solid as it had been. Something had shifted in there over 3 days of being still and being tended and being spoken to like a human being rather than a figure on a poster. "I will not come back," he said. "I meant that as a promise, not a threat. I will not bring trouble back to your gate." "I know," she said. "That is the condition I stated." He nodded. He saddled his horse, which was moving better after 3 days of good feed and rest, and he put his foot in the stirrup and swung up, and she thought that was the end of it, that he would ride away, and she would think about him for a while, and then fold that experience up and put it away somewhere in the back of her mind and go back to her fence line and her garden and her hens. But he looked back from the gate. Just once. He held her gaze for a long moment across the 30 feet of yard between them, and she did not look away, and then he turned his horse north and he was gone. She stood there for a longer time than she would have cared to admit. Then she went inside and washed her face over the basin and told herself very firmly that she had done a good thing for a man who needed help, and that was the beginning and the end of it. She did not think she believed herself, but she said it anyway. 3 weeks passed. The frost came, exactly as she had feared, and she spent 2 mornings on the roof with tar and shingles she had bought in town, working before the light had fully come up so the cold would not seep through too badly while she worked. The farm settled into its autumn rhythm. The pigs fattened, the hens laid steadily, the well held enough water to get through if the winter was not too dry. She went to town twice, bought supplies, exchanged brief words with the shopkeeper's wife and the preacher's housekeeper, and came home again to her quiet house and her animals and the company of her own thoughts. She heard about Milton Stone on her first trip to town. A group of men outside the saloon were talking loudly about how the Tremaine brothers, bounty hunters who worked out of Dodge, had picked up his trail south of Caldwell and nearly caught him near a homestead 2 miles out. She had kept her face perfectly still and her pace perfectly even, walking past them with her basket on her arm, and she had not allowed herself to react until she was back in her wagon and moving down the road and safely out of sight of anyone who might be watching. Then she let out a long breath and gripped the reins tighter than she needed to. They had been close. They had been at her farm, essentially, or close enough that the description could not mean anywhere else. They had not found him because she had told him to ride through the creek, and he had. She was glad of that in a way that was purely human and warm and had nothing to do with practicality at all. She did not let herself think about what that meant. The second trip to town, a week later, she heard that Milton Stone had been seen as far north as Abilene, and that the Tremaine brothers had given up the chase and moved on to a more profitable quarry. The territory marshal was still keeping the posters up, but the active pursuit had cooled. She filed this information away without comment. November came. She was splitting wood behind the barn on a cold, clear morning when she heard the gate, the specific sound of the chain being lifted, and her hands tightened on the axe handle. She straightened and turned around. Milton Stone was standing at her gate with his hat in his hands. He was cleaner than the last time, clean-shaven, with new clothes that were trail-worn but not ragged, and his horse looked rested. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret, something careful and a little uncertain, which was so different from the composed stillness he had worn during those 3 days in October that it made her chest do something complicated. "I said I would not come back," he said. "I am aware of that." She stood with the axe at her side and looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you did say that. I mean to keep that promise eventually," he said. "But I rode 30 miles out of my way to get here, and I was 50 miles south before I understood why. And once I understood why, it seemed dishonest to keep riding away from it." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the cottonwood at the corner of the yard and scattered a handful of late leaves. A crow called from somewhere on the fence line. "You fixed some boards," she said finally. "I did," he said. "My chicken coop door has been sticking since July," she said. Something moved across his face. "I can fix a sticking door," he said. "I know you can," she said, and she walked to the gate and opened it. He stayed through November. Not in the barn this time. She would not have that. She had a perfectly good spare room with a bed and a window that looked east, and she was not going to have a man sleeping in a horse stall when there was a proper bed available, regardless of who or what he was. He ate at her table and sat by her fire in the evenings, and they talked for hours. Long, quiet conversations that ranged across everything. His life on the trail and her life in Missouri before she came west, the state of the territory, the injustice of land policy that drove families off their claims when corporations wanted the land back, the particular quality of the light on the Kansas plain in winter. He read when she lent him books from the small shelf James had left, and he read carefully, going back over sentences the way a man does when he is genuinely thinking about what words mean. He told her more, during those long evenings, about how he had come to be what he was. It had started in 1876, he told her, when the Cattlemen's Association in his county had hired men with legal authority and no moral restraint to clear homesteaders from land they claimed the ranchers needed for grazing, and Milton had been among those homesteaders. And when the law failed him and his neighbors, he had taken matters into his own hands in ways that the law then punished him for. The killing of the deputy in Wichita was not what the poster made it sound like, he said. The deputy had been accepting payment from the Treming interests and had been in the process of shooting an unarmed man when Milton interfered. The courts had not seen it that way, or rather, the men who owned the courts had not seen it that way, which was a different and more damning thing. She listened to all of this with the same careful attention she gave to everything, not accepting it wholesale because it was his own account of himself, but not dismissing it either, because she had lived long enough in this territory to know that the law and justice were often traveling in entirely opposite directions, and that the difference between an outlaw and a man the law had turned its back on was sometimes only a matter of whose money was speaking. She did not tell him she believed him. She told him that she understood how men ended up on roads they had not intended to travel, and that she knew the territory's official account of things was rarely the whole story. That seemed to matter to him. He sat very still in the lamplight and nodded once, and the wall behind his eyes came down another degree. She was developing feelings she had promised herself she would not develop. She recognized them with the clear-eyed practicality she brought to all difficult things. The way her heart lifted when she heard him moving around in the morning before she came downstairs. The way her attention kept finding him in whatever room he occupied. The way his hands looked in the firelight, broad and capable, the hands of a man who had worked all his life, and the ache she felt looking at them. She had loved James Rourke with a steady and real love that had been the center of her life for 6 years, and she had mourned him properly, and she still thought of him with warmth. What she felt stirring now was something different in texture, something with more urgency and more risk in it, possibly because the man sitting across the fire from her was in a situation that had no clear and simple resolution. She addressed this directly on a Tuesday evening in the second week of November. She was not the kind of woman who let things fester. "You know I am not a foolish woman," she said, without preamble, setting down the sock she had been darning. He looked up from the book. "I do know that," he said. "Then you will understand why I want to say directly that whatever is happening between us is something I take seriously, and I do not take it seriously lightly, and I need to know what you intend." He set the book down. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes for a long moment. "What do you think is happening between us?" he asked, not evasively but with genuine care, as though he wanted to know her account of it before he gave his own. "I think we have come to mean something to each other in a way that is honest and not small," she said. "And I think the difficulty is that you are wanted by the law and I am a woman who has to live in this county for the rest of my life, and those two facts sit uncomfortably against each other." "They do," he said. "So," she said, "what do you intend?" He was quiet for a long moment, not evasively, not to avoid the question, but because he was taking it seriously. She could tell the difference. "What I intend and what is possible are not the same thing right now," he said finally. "What I intend is to be worthy of you. What is possible depends on things I am still working to change." He paused. "I have been in contact with a man in Abilene, a lawyer, who believes there is a case to be made about the Wichita incident. There are witnesses still living who know what happened. The deputy I shot was not a clean man. If it can be brought before the right judge without the Tremaine money in the room, it might look different. That is a long road, she said. It is, he said. I am a patient woman, she said. But I am also an honest woman, so let me say honestly that I do not want to sit here and feel what I am feeling and have it come to nothing. I am not talking about promises. I am talking about knowing whether the road is real or whether it is a comfortable story. He looked at her for a long time. Then he got up from his chair, crossed the room, and crouched down in front of her so their eyes were level, and she felt every ounce of his attention on her like sunlight, warm and very direct. It is real, he said. I have not told that story to anyone before because it never mattered before whether it was real or not. It matters now. She looked at him. The firelight was on the left side of his face, the side with the scar, and it made him look both older and younger than his years. The scar a testimony to how hard his life had been, and the expression beneath it something unguarded and genuine. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw, the first time she had touched him since she had tended his wound, and she felt him go very still under her hand. Then go see your lawyer, she said, and come back to me when you know what there is to come back to. He turned his face slightly into her palm. His eyes closed for just a moment. I will, he said. He left the next morning before the sun was fully up, and she stood at the gate and watched him ride north toward Abilene. And this time when he looked back from the rise she lifted her hand, and he lifted his, and that felt like more of a promise than words. December was the hardest month she had spent since the first December after James died. She went about her work with determination, and she did not allow herself to brood. But the house was quieter than it had been in a long time, and the quiet had a different quality now, not the comfortable solitude she had built for herself, but something with an absence at the center of it. She wrote letters she did not send, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the lamp turned up high, writing out the things she thought and felt in the careful, neat hand her mother had drilled into her, and then folding the letters and pressing them flat and keeping them in the drawer of the side table like a private accounting of her heart. January brought snow, which was not unusual, and with the snow came a man she did not expect. His name was Garrett Tremaine, and he knocked on her front door on a morning when 6 inches of snow lay across the yard, and the temperature had not climbed above freezing for a week. He was a narrow-faced man in his mid-40s with cold gray eyes and a deputy's badge that she recognized as belonging to a private arrangement rather than any official county authority, the kind of badge that money bought. He had 2 men with him who stayed at the edge of the yard. She opened the door and looked at him through the gap. Mrs. Rourke, he said pleasantly, I am looking for information about a man named Milton Stone. We have reason to believe he was sheltering somewhere on this road back in October. A great many people travel this road, she said. He would have been injured, Tremaine said. A gunshot wound left side. I have not seen anyone of that description, she said, which was technically true. She had not seen such a person recently, and she had decided that the technical precision was morally acceptable given the quality of the man asking. Tremaine smiled in a way that had nothing warm in it. You would tell me if you had, I expect. The reward is considerable. I am well aware of the reward, she said. I have seen the posters. Was there anything else? He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes, studying her face the way a man looks at a door. He is deciding whether to push harder. She met his gaze with perfect steadiness and kept her hand on the door, not wide open, not slammed shut, just held at the width of a conversation, ordinary and untroubled. If you see anything, he said, or hear anything. He set a card on the doorframe, a printed card with his name and the Dodge City address of the Tremaine Bounty Agency. I will certainly consider my options, she said, and closed the door. She listened to the sound of them riding away through the snow, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and made herself breathe steadily until her hands stopped being tense. She was in it now. She had known she was in it since October, but Tremaine at her door made it real in a different way. She was not frightened exactly. She was aware, the way you are aware on the edge of a high place, of exactly what she was risking and exactly how far there was to fall, and she found, sitting there at the table, that she did not want to take it back. She had chosen from the moment she unhooked that chain, and she was a woman who stood behind her choices. February came, and the middle of it brought a letter. She found it in the post office on her first trip to town after the thaw, among a handful of flyers and an invoice from the seed company. It had no name on the outside, just her address in handwriting she recognized immediately, because it was careful and restrained in the way he was careful and restrained, not cramped but deliberate. She put it in her basket under the seed invoice and did not open it until she was home, and the horse was put up, and the door was closed, and she was sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The letter was 3 pages long, and she read every word of it twice. He was in Abilene. The lawyer's name was Brodigan, and he was a careful man who had been building a case quietly for 2 years against the Tremain interests, not for noble reasons necessarily, but because the Tremain brothers had ruined a client of his and personal grievances made for motivated lawyers. There were 3 witnesses willing to testify about the Wichita incident, men who had been there and knew what the deputy had been doing before Milton's interference, men who had previously been too afraid to speak, but who, with Brodigan managing the risk, were willing to go on record. The case would need to go to a federal circuit judge, not the county court where the Tremain money held influence, and Brodigan believed he could get it there by spring. He told her he thought about her farm every morning. He told her he had been reading a history of the territory she had lent him that he had accidentally taken when he left in November, and was now deeply apologetic about, but also deeply into, and would return it in person if she would permit that. He told her that the road was real, as he had said it was, and that he was working toward it with everything he had. At the bottom of the 3rd page, after all the practical facts and the careful account of the situation, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the rest, as though written quickly before he could think better of it, he had written, "I find I am most myself when I am talking to you. That is not something I have been able to say often in my life, and it is worth more to me than I know how to properly express." She read that part a 3rd time. Then she put the letter in the drawer with her unsent ones, and sat for a while in the quiet kitchen with the winter light coming through the window and a feeling in her chest that was warm and bright and a little terrifying and entirely worth it. She wrote back that same evening. She told him about the winter, about the farm, about Garrett Tremain at her door in January, about the way the snow had looked across the pasture at sunrise that morning, blue-white and unmarked. She told him she had been reading as well, a novel she had ordered from the bookseller in Wichita, and she described the best parts of it. She told him the book he had borrowed was forgiven under the condition that he finish it and tell her what he thought. Near the end, in her own slightly less controlled handwriting, she wrote, "I set a 2nd cup out on the table some mornings before I remember. I think that is as clear a statement as I am capable of making." She sent the letter to the address he had given her in Abilene, and then she went to bed and slept better than she had in months. They wrote back and forth through February and March, letters that crossed in transit sometimes, arriving in the wrong order so that she would receive an answer before the question, which had the pleasant effect of making their correspondence feel like a conversation happening in 2 directions at once. She learned things about him through his letters that even the long evenings by the fire had not revealed, the small domestic things, that he made his coffee too strong, that he had a habit of getting up before dawn because he had never entirely shaken the trail drive hours, that he had once worked briefly as a schoolteacher's assistant in a small town in Missouri, and had genuinely enjoyed it, that he had a streak of dry humor that came through more clearly in writing than in person, where he kept it on a shorter rein. March brought more news from Brodigan, passed through a 2nd letter, that the case was progressing. A federal circuit judge named Haverford was sitting in Wichita in April, and Brodigan intended to have the matter before him. The Tremain interests had gotten wind of it, as these things inevitably did when money started moving around a courtroom, and there was some indication they were applying pressure to have the hearing postponed or the venue changed. But Brodigan was a tenacious man and did not seem inclined to yield. Milton's letter accompanying this news was more guarded than his previous ones, carefully optimistic in the way a man is when he is trying not to make promises he cannot yet back. But she could read the hope in it, and she held it carefully like a lit match in wind. April arrived with thunderstorms that rolled in from the southwest and shook the windows at night, the kind of storms that made the horses uneasy and the cattle lurch against their fences. Lillian was in the barn on the first Thursday of the month, talking to her horses in the low, even voice that settled them, when she heard the gate. She knew the sound of it by now. She knew the specific quality of the chain, the weight of the latch, the way the post settled when it was opened. She walked to the barn door and looked out through the rain. Milton Stone was coming across her yard leading his horse, bent forward into the rain, his hat streaming water. He looked up and saw her in the barn doorway, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face. There was relief in it and exhaustion, and something luminous underneath both of those things that made her forget briefly about the practical things. She stepped back and let him bring the horse in out of the rain. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, water running off his hat brim, looking at her. She was aware that she had hay in her hair from the morning's feeding, and that her apron was not clean, and that she was not in any way prepared to be looked at the way he was looking at her. And she found she did not care about any of that at all. "It went through," he said. "Judge Haverford, 2 days ago. Brodigan put the witnesses on the record and the evidence about the deputy's arrangements, and Haverford ruled that the original charges were filed fraudulently in a compromised court. The warrant is vacated. I am not wanted anymore." He said the last sentence with a kind of wondering quality, as though he was still getting acquainted with the reality of it. Lillian looked at him for a long moment. The thunder moved over the barn and the rain intensified on the roof, drumming hard and steady. One of the horses stamped, and she put her hand briefly on its neck to calm it without taking her eyes off Milton. "Say that again," she said. "The warrant is vacated," he said. "I am a free man, legally free, I mean, for the first time in 6 years. She crossed the barn and put her arms around him. It surprised them both, she thought, but he wrapped his arms around her without any hesitation at all, tightly, the way a person holds something they have been afraid of losing, and she could feel the tension going out of him in a long breath against the top of her head, and she thought, standing there in the rain sound and the horse smell and the warmth of him, that she had been right, back in October, to open the gate. Some decisions a person makes below the level of logic in some deeper register of themselves, and those decisions are sometimes the truest ones. She stepped back and looked up at him. His eyes were very dark and very bright. "Congratulations, Milton Stone," she said. "Lillian Rourke," he said. "I would very much like to stay, if you would have me." "I opened my gate for you in October," she said. "I intend to keep it open." He kissed her then, which she had been expecting and still was not prepared for, warm and careful and then not careful at all. And the barn around them was full of the sound of rain, and the horses moved in their stalls, and the whole world was very small and very right. The months that followed were the best of Lillian Rourke's life, and she was not a woman who said such things carelessly or without the weight of comparison behind them. She had loved James Rourke, and her life with him had been good and real, and she honored it. But what grew between her and Milton through that spring and summer of 1883 was something with a different quality, something built not out of youth and hope, but out of two people who had already been broken and rebuilt, and who chose each other with full knowledge of what choosing cost. He was good with her farm. Better than she had expected, though she should perhaps have expected it, given that he came from farming and had spent 20 years learning the land in various ways. He fixed the things that needed fixing, not just the visible things but the structural things, reinforced the barn where the foundation was settling, redug the well to a better depth, and lined it properly so it would not go dry in a dry summer. He had a quiet competence about physical work that she found deeply satisfying to watch, not because she needed him to do it, but because the doing of it was a form of care, and she recognized it as such. He was patient with her independence, which was not nothing. Some men interpreted a competent woman as a challenge, something to diminish or redirect. He did not. He worked beside her and deferred to her knowledge of her own land and her own animals, and when she did things her way instead of his way, he watched with genuine curiosity rather than correction. She found this made her more willing to take his suggestions when he offered them, which she thought was probably not a coincidence. She loved the way he was in the mornings, up before her always, the coffee already made when she came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with a book, or with his hands wrapped around a cup looking out the east window at the light coming up across the pasture. She would pour her coffee and sit across from him, and they would talk or not talk, and both were equally good. The easy comfort of it amazed her, the way something that had not existed 6 months ago could feel so fundamental. She loved the way he laughed, which was rare enough to feel valuable, a real laugh that came from somewhere unguarded in him, and lasted only a moment before the composure came back, though a warmth remained afterward. She worked at making him laugh because the reward was considerable. He told her things, as the spring went on, that he had not told anyone. About his brother, who had died on a cattle drive in 1878, a fact he had been carrying alone since then. About the years of running, the particular texture of a life spent always watching the door, the way it had shaped him into someone who moved through space differently than other people did, always facing out, always assessing. About the things he had done that he was not proud of, said without self-pity but with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the costs, and she listened to all of it with the same care she brought to everything, and offered neither absolution nor condemnation, just the honest presence of a person who was paying attention. She told him things in return. About the grief of losing James, the specific form it had taken, not just the sorrow but the displacement, the way your own life becomes unfamiliar without the person you have organized it around. About the loneliness that had followed, the 2-year stretch when she spoke to almost no one, and it had been almost enough, and almost had been the loneliest word she knew. About the decision to stay on the farm rather than go back to Missouri, which had been the right decision, and she knew it was right, and it had still been the hardest thing she had done. On a Sunday evening in May, sitting on the porch steps with the last of the light going pink and gold across the western sky, he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say I will accept it and nothing between us changes." She looked at him steadily. "Ask it then." "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because I think you need someone to look after your farm or your affairs, because you clearly do not. And not because it is the appropriate thing to do given our present arrangement, though it is. But because I love you, Lillian, with the clearest and most certain part of whatever I am, and I want to be your husband. I want the right to be here. Not on sufferance and not on invitation, but because it is where I belong." She looked at him for a long time. A nighthawk swept low over the pasture and banked away into the darkening sky. The first stars were appearing in the east. "You already belong here," she said, "but yes, ask it properly." He turned to her fully and took her hand in his. "Lillian Rourke," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Milton Stone, I will marry you." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, and she felt the warmth of it move all the way up her arm and into her chest, where it stayed, bright and settled and entirely sure. They were married on a Saturday in June, 1883, in the Caldwell Methodist Church by Reverend Aldous, who had known Lillian since she came to the territory, and was clearly trying not to show how surprised he was at the match without entirely succeeding. There were perhaps 20 people in attendance: the shopkeeper and his wife, the doctor who had her in his practice, 2 neighboring farm families she had come to know over the years, and a handful of other town people who turned out partly from genuine goodwill and partly, she suspected, from curiosity. Milton wore a dark coat that he had bought in Abilene for the occasion and a white shirt, and his boots were clean. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with the careful attention he brought to everything he valued, and she walked toward him in her good blue dress with her hair down around her shoulders for the first time in public in years, and the distance between them got smaller and smaller until she was standing beside him, and Reverend Aldous began to speak. She said her vows in a clear and steady voice. He said his in that low, level voice she had loved from the first morning, and his eyes did not leave her face for the whole of the ceremony. When Reverend Aldous said he could kiss his bride, Milton Stone put his hands on either side of her face with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and kissed her in front of 20 people and the Methodist God and the Kansas sky, and several of the women in the pews made small, involuntary sounds of approval. They went home to the farm in the late afternoon, just the two of them, and the farm felt different when they came through the gate together, both of them, the same gate where this had all begun 8 months ago, and she noticed that Milton took the chain off the gate post and just left the gate standing open when they came through, and when she looked at him questioningly he smiled at her, that rare real smile that changed his whole face, and she understood what he meant. No more keeping the world out. No more latching against what might come. They were here and they were together, and the gate stood open. The summer settled into a richness she had not anticipated. They worked the farm through the hot months, planting the second garden, keeping the cattle through the grass season, and she watched him grow into the land the way a tree grows into its soil, slowly and surely, and with increasing permanence. He was still a man who noticed every door, who sat with his back to the wall in any public place, who heard sounds outside at night before she did. But those were old habits from an old life, and they were fading gradually, not gone but receding, losing their urgency as the months of safety and ordinariness accumulated. He went to Abilene in August to see Brodigan one final time, to sign some papers that formalized the legal situation, and she was alone on the farm for a week, and the aloneness felt different from how it had felt before. Not the hollow aloneness of a woman building her walls, but the temporary aloneness of a woman whose husband was coming back, which was not aloneness at all really. It was just a pause in a continuous thing. He came back with the papers, and with a bolt of blue calico she had mentioned once, in passing, in a letter months ago, that she had seen in the Abilene shop window and liked. He set it on the kitchen table without comment, and she looked at it and looked at him, and then had to turn her face away for a moment because the simple fact of him remembering and acting on a small thing she had said in a letter was more affecting than she expected. "I remember what you tell me," he said quietly behind her. "I know," she said, getting herself back together. "I know you do." They found out in October, 1 year after the first time she had opened the gate, that she was expecting a child. She was 30 years old and healthy, and had been wondering privately if it would happen for her given that she and James had tried for a year without result. And the realization came with such an overwhelming rush of competing feelings, joy and fear and disbelief, and a profound gratitude, that she sat down heavily in the kitchen chair and pressed her hands flat on the table and just breathed for a moment. She told him that evening at the supper table, not with any preamble, just set down her fork and said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the spring." He went very still. His dark eyes found hers across the table. "Are you certain?" he said. "As certain as one can be at this stage," she said. "I will have Dr. Marsh confirm it when I go to town next week." He stood up from his chair so suddenly that it scraped back on the floor, and she thought for a disoriented moment that he was going to walk out the door, and then he came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her the way he had that first time in the barn doorway, arms wrapped close, face against her hair. "Lillian," he said. His voice was not level. It had the quality of a man who has received news so good that his control over his voice is no longer something he can guarantee. She put her arms around him. "I thought you should know," she said, which was an absurd thing to say given the gravity of the moment, and she felt him laugh against her hair, that rare genuine laugh. "I thought you should know," he repeated with deep affection. "Yes, yes, I thought I should know." Winter of 1883 going into 1884 was, improbably, a winter she remembered as warm not in temperature but in the quality of her life. The farm was snowed in for stretches of January and February, and they were contained together in the house and the barn and the small, steady world of the property. And she found those long indoor days not confining but intimate, lit by the particular warmth of two people who have made their peace with the world and with each other. He read to her in the evenings, which she had not expected but which she loved. He had a good reading voice, the same low-level tone that was easy to listen to for a long time, and they worked through 2 novels and a history of the Kishom Trail that made him laugh more than once with its inaccuracies. She talked to him about things she had previously only talked to herself about, the big and the small of it, the philosophy and the gossip and the farm management and the books, and he was the same, more open now than the man who had sat across her fire in October a year and a half ago, the wall mostly gone, replaced by something better. He worried about the birth in a way he did not say directly but that she could see in the way he watched her, and in the occasional tightening around his eyes when she did something that strained her. She addressed this directly. "I am healthy," she told him one evening. "Dr. Marsh says I am in excellent condition. Women have babies every day." "Women also," he began and then stopped. "Yes," she said. "Some women have difficulty, I know that, I'm not pretending otherwise, but worrying about it daily is not going to change what happens, and watching me like I'm made of glass is going to wear us both out." "I am not watching you like you are made of glass," he said. "You checked the ice on the porch step 4 times this morning," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "3 times," he said. "Milton." "The porch step is genuinely icy," he said, but there was a slight shift in his expression that conceded the point. She reached across and put her hand over his. "I am here," she said. "We are both here. I intend to be here a considerable time longer, and so does this child, and so do you. Allow that to be true." He turned his hand over and held hers. "Allowing things to be true is something I am still practicing," he said. "I know," she said. "You are getting better at it." He was. The baby came on a March morning in 1884, which was fitting in a way she could not have designed, spring beginning and new life arriving at the same moment, the snow melting at the edges and the first pale grass showing through in the low spots of the pasture. Dr. Marsh was there, and the midwife Mrs. Hollies, who had been delivering babies in Caldwell since the town had been standing, and Milton was not permitted in the room, which was the practice of the time, but she could hear him on the other side of the door, the pacing that told her he was doing the thing she had told him not to do, which was worry. The labor was long and hard, and she worked through it with the same focused determination she brought to anything difficult, concentrating on the mechanics of it, breathing the way Mrs. Hollies told her to breathe, keeping her mind on the immediate task rather than on anything beyond it. It was not comfortable, and it was not easy, and there were moments when she thought with considerable force about what she might say to Milton Stone when this was over, on the general subject of whose idea this had been. And then it was over, and Mrs. Hollies said, "A fine boy, Mrs. Stone, a strong one," and placed a small, warm, furious person in her arms, and every thought about blame evaporated entirely. She lay there looking at her son, who had Milton's dark eyes and her light brows and a pair of fists that were working furiously at the air, and she felt the kind of love that hits you like weather, everywhere at once, no preparation possible. "Go get my husband," she said to Mrs. Hollies. Milton came through the door and stopped at the foot of the bed and looked at her, checking her first, face and color and the quality of her expression, before he looked at the baby, and she loved him acutely for the order of that, for the fact that she was his first concern. "Come here," she said. Come and meet your son." He came to the side of the bed and looked down at the baby in her arms, and his face did the thing it did when his wall came entirely down. And he sat on the edge of the bed and reached out with one careful finger and touched the back of the baby's fist. And the baby's fist opened and closed around his finger with the instinctive grip of newborns. And Milton Stone, the most wanted man in the territory, made a sound she had never heard him make before, a soft exhale of absolute undone tenderness. "Hello," he said very quietly to his son. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He looked at her. "James," he said without hesitation, "if that is suitable to you, for your husband." She had not expected that. She had not expected it at all, and the generosity of it, the depth of understanding it required to offer that, the willingness to honor the life she had lived before him without jealousy or diminishment, made her love him in a new register she had not known was available. "James Milton Stone," she said. "Yes, that is exactly right." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, and then he sat beside her on the bed and watched their son sleep. And the March light came through the window and lay across all three of them, warm and new. James was a strong baby who became a sturdy toddler who became an active small boy who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination. And the combination was, his parents agreed privately, going to require considerable management. He walked early and ran before anyone was prepared, and had opinions about everything from the moment he had language to express them, which he had early and abundantly. Milton was a different man as a father than she might have predicted, or rather, he was exactly the same man in a new context, quiet and steady and paying enormous attention. He was patient with the baby's nighttime wakings in a way that surprised her and touched her deeply, getting up in the dark without complaint to walk the child or rock him, coming back to bed an hour later, and fitting himself around her in the dark without waking her fully, which was a small continuous act of love that she felt accumulating over months into something vast. He taught James things from the earliest possible age, the names of the plants and the birds, the habits of the animals, the way the sky looked when weather was coming. James listened to his father with focused attention that he did not bring to most adults, which Lillian watched with a warm satisfaction that made her chest feel almost too full. Life in Caldwell stabilized. The Tremaine brothers moved their operation to Colorado in 1884, following more profitable hunting grounds, and the specific threat they had represented receded. Brodigan had done his work well, and the legal situation remained clean. Milton was known in Caldwell now as Lillian Stone's husband and a hard-working farmer south of town, and while some people knew his history and some were cautious because of it, the community was a practical one and reputation was built over time by behavior, and his behavior was consistent and solid, and the caution faded. He joined the voluntary fire brigade that the town organized in 1884, which amused her. The most wanted man in the territory, standing on Main Street in Caldwell with a bucket, willing and useful. He made a few genuine friendships through it, men who valued competence and steadiness, and did not particularly care about the past, and she watched him navigate these friendships with the same careful quality he brought to everything, slow to open but solid once he did. She went back to work on the farm fully when James was old enough to be minded, and she found it deeply satisfying to be working beside Milton again in the full way, not the limited way of pregnancy. They were good partners in work, complementary in their approaches, his thoroughness pairing well with her efficiency, and the farm prospered in ways it had not quite managed when she was running it alone. In 1886, when James was too energetic and deeply interested in the chickens, which was not always convenient for the chickens, Lillian found herself expecting again. She told Milton at the supper table, the same way she had told him the first time, setting down her fork mid-meal, and he looked up at her with the same dark eyes and the same stillness. But this time there was less fear in it and more pure joy, because he had been through it once and knew it was possible to arrive at the other side. Again, he said, with a quality in his voice that was half disbelief and entirely warm. "Again," she said. "In the winter, I think." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and James, who was sitting at the table eating cornbread and ignoring the grown people's conversation, looked up and said, with his father's precise diction, "What is happening?" "Something good," Milton told him. "Is it cake?" James asked. "It is better than cake," Lillian said. James considered this skeptically, in a way that was so completely his father's expression that she had to press her lips together not to smile. The second child arrived in December of 1886, a girl with Lillian's honey-brown hair and her father's dark eyes, and a pair of lungs that made her initial feelings on the subject of the world perfectly clear. They named her Clara, and James, who had been solemnly informed in advance that something good was coming, regarded his sister with an expression of serious evaluation that resolved, over the first week, into a proprietary protectiveness that endured for the rest of their childhood. The winter of 1886 and 1887 was cold and confined, with 2 small children in the house, and the endless particular work of infancy layered onto the farm work in the household. And there were days that were genuinely hard, days of exhaustion, and the kind of fraying that comes with relentlessness. But there were also evenings when the children were sleeping, and the house was quiet, and she and Milton sat by the fire with their coffee, and she thought that this was exactly it. This was the thing she had not known she was working toward all those years of building walls and latching gates. This warmth, these 2 dark heads in the lamplight, this man across the fire who knew her entirely and stayed. He told her one evening, when Clara was 3 months old and James was somewhere in the barn probably bothering the horses, about a thing that had been in his mind. He wanted to expand the farm, he said. The property to the east had come available, 15 acres of good grazing land, and they had enough saved that it was possible. He had looked at the figures and thought it was sound, but it was her land, her farm, and he wanted it to be a joint decision. She looked at him. He had been saying things like this for 3 years now. Her land, her farm, always careful to locate the ownership where it had begun, never assuming that marriage changed the geography of what was hers. She had told him twice already that his labor and his care had made it as much his as hers, and he received this graciously and then continued to qualify his suggestions as suggestions rather than pronouncements, and she had decided this was a quality she would simply love about him rather than argue him out of. "The east pasture has been on my mind as well," she said. "I looked at those figures last month. Yes, let us do it." He nodded, satisfied. "I will speak to Patterson Monday," he said. "I will come with you," she said. "It is a joint purchase. Patterson should see us both in the room." He looked at her with that expression she had come to know very well over 4 years, the one that was warm and steady, and a little bit amused by her and entirely admiring. "Yes," he said. "He should." They bought the east pasture and expanded the herd in the spring of 1887, and the farm grew into something prosperous and solid, a real going concern rather than a woman holding on by herself against the weight of prairie solitude. 2 families from the east came through that year looking to settle, and Milton helped them locate suitable claims, spending a week showing them the land and the water sources and the practical considerations, paying forward in some accumulated way the help he had been given when he needed it most. The years settled into their own rhythm, rich and full, marked by the ordinary, extraordinary events of a life shared with commitment. James started school in Caldwell in 1888 and took to it with a seriousness that pleased his mother and made his father proud in the quiet way that Milton showed pride, not loudly but permanently. Clara followed him 2 years later and was, from the first day, the social engine of her class, returning home every afternoon with detailed accounts of everyone's business that she delivered to her parents with the authority of a correspondent filing a report. In 1889, Kansas was working through the upheaval of the Farmers' Alliance movement. The growing recognition that the railroads and the banks and the large land interests had been systematically disadvantaging the small farmer for years, extracting profit while leaving the people who actually worked the land with less and less to show for it. These were not abstractions to Lillian and Milton. They had lived the consequences of those imbalances from different angles. She through the grinding economics of solo farming, and he through the dispossession that had set his whole life on its disastrous course. They attended the alliance meetings in Caldwell, and Milton spoke at 2 of them, which was notable because he was not a man who sought public attention, and the people who heard him found his manner plain and direct and credible in the way that comes from experience rather than theory. She watched him at those meetings and thought about the man she had first seen at her gate, pale with blood loss and composed with effort, and the distance between that moment and this one, this capable, settled man speaking at a meeting table with other farmers, was a distance she had in some part helped him travel, and she was proud of that without making it about herself, because the traveling had been his to do. Their life was not without difficulty. Nothing worthwhile is. There were dry summers that strained the water and the grazing, a sickness that moved through the cattle in 1890 and took 8 animals before they caught it, a year when the prices dropped so badly that the books barely balanced, and they had conversations at the kitchen table late into the night about adjustments and plans, working through it together with the practical intimacy of 2 people who trust each other's judgment. These difficulties were real and sometimes frightening, but they were never unbearable, because she had someone to face them with. Milton had nightmares sometimes, less often as the years went on, but they did not disappear entirely. She had learned not to wake him during them, just to be there when he came up from the dream with that old alertness snapping into his eyes, and to speak his name quietly so he knew where he was. He would settle and breathe, and after a moment reach for her hand in the dark, and she gave him her hand, and they would lie there listening to the sounds of the farm, the horses in the barn, the wind across the prairie, the breathing of the children in their rooms, until the dream receded and sleep came back. In the mornings after those nights he was always up earliest, coffee made and face turned toward the east window before she came down, but she found him different from the man who had done the same thing in that first October, less braced against the day, more simply present in it. One April morning in 1891, when James was 7 and Clara was 4, and the farm was green with spring, and the gate stood permanently open now as a matter of principle and practice. Lillian was standing in the garden looking at the state of the seedlings when she heard the familiar sound of her husband's boots on the porch steps and then the yard. She did not look up immediately. She was assessing a row of beans that needed thinning, but she was aware of him crossing the yard toward her. He stopped beside her and looked at the garden. "The beans need thinning," he said. "I know," she said. "I am looking at the beans. Do you want help with the beans? I want you to tell me why you are standing in the yard looking at me instead of finishing the mending on the south fence that you started yesterday." He was quiet for a moment. "I finished the fence," he said. She looked up at that, because he never finished projects in one go without mentioning it. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and a little wondering, and it made her stand up straight and give him her full attention. "I was thinking," he said, "about October 1882. "A great deal has happened since October 1882, she said. "Yes," he said. "All of it, every piece of it, started because you opened a gate for a bleeding stranger and did not turn him in for the money. I have thought about why you did that for 9 years. He paused. "I have never asked you directly." She looked at him. The spring wind moved through the garden and through her hair, and somewhere in the barn James's voice rose in a one-sided argument with a horse about something. "I told you at the time," she said. "You were a bleeding man. That was what I saw." "That is what you said," he agreed. "But I have known you a long time now, Lillian. I know that is not all of it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. The honest answer was one she had not quite articulated before, not even to herself entirely, but here in the spring garden with her husband watching her with 9 years of love and attention behind his eyes, she found she had words for it. I had been keeping that gate latched for 2 years, she said. Against everything. People feeling the world. I had made it very secure and very necessary, and I told myself it was wisdom. And then you came to it and you were hurt and you needed help, and something in me knew that the gate had been latched too long. That keeping things out long enough is its own kind of damage. She looked at him. I think I needed to open it as much as you needed me to. He was very still, looking at her. I did not know you were going to be on the other side of it, she said. I just knew I needed to open it, and you were there. He crossed the garden in 3 steps carefully, avoiding the seedling rows, and took her face in his hands, and she put her hands over his, and they stood there in the spring garden with the Kansas sky enormous and bright above them and the farm alive and growing in every direction around them. I was there, he said softly. You were there, she said. He kissed her among the seedlings and the spring wind and the distant sound of James losing his argument with the horse, and she kissed him back with the full weight of everything she was, and everything they had built and everything that was still ahead of them, all of it pressing forward into a future that was not guaranteed. No future is, but that was theirs. Built from the moment she had unhooked a chain on a cold October morning, and decided that a person in need was more important than her very good reasons for keeping the world out. The gate stayed open. They both made sure of it. A permanent and symbolic thing, the chain hung on the post out of the way, the cedar planks swinging free in the Kansas wind, open to whoever came down the road. Neighbors came through it for help and went back through it with whatever was needed. The children's friends came through it in the summers and went back through it at evening with full stomachs and dirty knees. The occasional traveler knocked and was given water and directions. The gate that Lillian had kept so carefully latched became, in time, something the South Road people associated with the Stone farm, that reliable open door, that household where help was available without requiring a long story first. Because she had learned, and she told this to Clara when her daughter was old enough to ask about the gate, she had learned that the people who needed to come through a gate are not usually the people you should be afraid of. The people you should be afraid of, she said, do not stop at gates at all. They come through walls and over fences and in the dark. The person at a gate, standing visible and asking, is usually just a person, bleeding or lost or tired, and the only question worth asking is whether you have the capacity to help, and if you do, you should. Clara listened to this with the focused attention she had gotten from her father, and then said, Is that how you knew to let Papa in? Lillian thought about a wanted poster on her henhouse wall, and a man on a lame horse in the October wind and the chain in her hand and the weight of it. More or less, she said, more or less. In 1893, Caldwell celebrated its 20th anniversary as an incorporated town, and there was a gathering in the main street with music and food, and the particular festive quality of a frontier community looking at how far it had come. Lillian and Milton went together with both children, James nearly 10 now and already taller than his mother, Clara 7, and in possession of social skills that eclipsed everyone in her immediate family. They ate corn, and listened to the fiddle players, and James ran with the other children, and Clara informed 3 different adults about the general state of things with great authority, and Milton stood beside Lillian at the edge of the crowd with his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, aware of the small particular warmth of it, the solid permanent fact of him beside her. The sun was going down in its dramatic Kansas fashion, turning the western sky enormous shades of red and gold, the way it did out here where there was nothing between you and the horizon. The fiddle players were playing something lively, and several couples were dancing in the street. Dance with me, she said. He looked at her. Here. That is generally where the dancing is, she said. He looked at the dancing couples for a moment, then back at her, and the expression on his face was the one she loved best, the one that meant he was doing something beyond his instinct because she was worth more than his instinct. All right, he said. He was not a natural dancer, but he was a willing one, and he had her hand in his and his other hand at her waist, and they moved through the music in the dusty street, with the sunset behind them and their children running somewhere through the crowd and the whole community of Caldwell moving around them. And she thought that she could not have imagined this, standing alone at her fence line in 1882, this fullness. She could not have invented it, but she had opened a gate and it had come through. "What are you thinking about?" he said against her temple, because he had learned to read her silences and knew when one of them had something in it. "About being grateful," she said. "For very specific things. Such as," he said, "such as you," she said, "and James and Clara and the farm and October 9 years ago." He pulled her slightly closer. "I am grateful for the same things," he said, "particularly October. Particularly the henhouse wall," she said. She felt him laugh, the rare real laugh against her hair. "Particularly the henhouse wall," he agreed. They danced until the fiddle players stopped, and then they found their children in the crowd and walked home in the last of the light along the South Road. The four of them. James describing in extensive detail the race he had run and the creative embellishment regarding its outcome that she noted and he denied. And Clara cataloging every notable thing she had observed in the crowd. And the farm came into view ahead of them. The house and the barn and the garden and the gate standing open at the property line. Open to the road and the world and everything that might come down it next, as it had stood open every day for years. She walked through it first, as she always did, because it was hers, and then Milton came through beside her with his hand at the small of her back, as he always did, and the children ran ahead toward the house, as they always did, and she reached back and touched his hand briefly, and he caught her fingers and held them and let go as they walked on. The Kansas sky overhead was enormous and full of stars, and the prairie stretched out in every direction, dark and wide, and full of the sounds of night, and the farmhouse windows were yellow with lamplight, warm against the dark, and she had a husband who had come through her gate bleeding and stayed for the rest of their lives. And she had 2 children who were the best things she had ever made. And she had a farm that was a real and living thing. And she had learned the lesson that all her careful latching had been keeping her from, that the things worth having require an open gate. She was 39 years old. She expected at least 40 more years if the world was agreeable, and she intended to spend every one of them exactly here, with the gate open and the lamp in the window and Milton Stone's hand to reach for in the dark. That seemed to her entirely sufficient. That seemed to her, in fact, the most she had ever wanted from any life, and the great and particular luck of her existence was that she had it, and she had chosen it, and it had chosen her back.